Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to House Talk. I am your host, Dr. Lory Dance, and what a powerful show we have for you tonight. I want to give a brief hello to Dr. Maiden. It was certainly his intention to join us tonight. He's still feeling a little bit under the weather, so we are all sending him good vibes and tons of love for a continued speedy recovery. Dr. Maiden, we love you and we miss you, and we know that you are listening in and sort of co-signing everything we're going to be talking about tonight. So hurry up and get well so you can join us again. Well, folks, incarceration is a public health crisis many of us are familiar with. Research about the relationship between incarceration rates and crime rates finds that since 2000, the increased use of jails and prisons accounted for nearly 0% of the overall reduction in crime. Incarceration is a complex and difficult topic impacting so many of us and has been sparking debates for years. This is exactly what House Talk is all about, having the complex and difficult conversations and providing transformative, solution-focused strategies to educate, empower, and liberate individuals for the purpose of bringing about change that strengthens our relationships, homes, communities, and ideally our nation. I would suffice it to say that every member of our global listening audience knows someone who is or has been incarcerated, or perhaps have themselves been incarcerated. And listeners, we want to hear from you during the show. So call us live with your comments or questions at 515-605-9744. Again, that's 515-605-9744. Now, the American public has decisively concluded that our approach to criminal justice, quite frankly, folks, it just isn't working. It's not working. Mass incarceration is the civil rights crisis of our time. The racial disparities pervasive in our justice system compound at every juncture. African Americans are more likely to be stopped by police, arrested, detained before trial, and given harsher sentences than whites. Worse, the disparities in our justice system perpetuate racial inequity in our society more broadly. Proposing ideas for transformative change requires a collaboration of great minds, and that is exactly what I've convened for tonight's show on mass incarceration, a public health crisis. Joining us tonight are Dr. Christine Clark, Professor of Curriculum and Instruction, Senior Scholar for Multicultural Education, and Founding Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dr. Karen B. McLean Dade, Donaldson, Professor for Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University. Dr. Dade's company, MIDC LLC, published The 25th Hour by Christopher Donaldson Jr. in 2018. Chris is still currently incarcerated and is awaiting a new release date. Dr. Dade will share more about the 25th Hour later on in the show. Last, but certainly not least, I'm also joined by Dr. Lory Dance, Associate Professor of Sociology and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and a visiting senior scholar, Lund University, Sweden, Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome to House Talk, ladies. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to have you with me tonight.
great to be here.
It's an honor to be asked. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you. I have one correction. I'm at the Center for Human Rights Studies at Lund University in Sweden.
Thank you for that correction. Thank you. So, how can we end mass incarceration in America? By now, the debate is over. Our nation grossly over-incarcerates its people. The United States has less than 5% of the world's population and nearly 1/4 of its prisoners. Astonishingly, if the 2.3 million incarcerated Americans were a state, it would be more populous than 16 other states. That just seems crazy to me, but okay. All told, 1 in 3 people in the United States has some type of criminal record. 1 in 3? No other industrialized country comes close. This system grew over decades in plain sight, and only a broad and bold national incarceration response will end it. Some of our listeners may not be clear on exactly what we mean when we talk about mass incarceration. So, ladies, for the sake of clarity, let's offer a definition of terms we'll be referencing tonight to ensure we're all on the same page with our listening audience. This being stated, what are mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, and the school-to-prison pipeline, and how are they related or connected? Whichever one.
Anybody want to jump in?
Why don't you start, Chris, and then I can kind of add to that, and I'm sure Dr. Dance will as well.
Okay. So I think without sort of thinking about this linearly, but maybe to some extent in a historical context, mass incarceration is the way in which law and policy operate to amass huge numbers of people in the United States in local, state, and federal jails, prisons, and detention centers. It primarily came about, the mass part of incarceration came about much more extensively in 1980 with the war on drugs. And at that time, the number of people that were incarcerated for nonviolent offenses was about 40,000, and by 2017, it was 500,000. But that's sort of a short-sighted view of mass incarceration. I would say that mass incarceration started in 1865 with the quote-unquote Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the United States, which in theory abolished involuntary servitude, except with the caveat that involuntary servitude could be continued as a punishment for the conviction of a crime. And so with the establishment of the 13th Amendment, basically legal enslavement has continued, and in the 1980s got a steroid injection is what I would say. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that before we move on to another term.
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of moved just to use Michelle Alexander's term on the new Jim Crow system, because I think it best describes this continuation from the institution of slavery to today. And so in teacher education, I strive to make my pre-service and graduate students aware of this intentional way that we're placing our youth into these systems early on, and then eventually how that leads into incarceration, which is a slave labor system. I'm also reminded, I know that Dr. Pitts, you asked about, well, what we can do. Yeah. And I'm reminded, it's incumbent upon us from the standpoint of, Richard Pryor coined something, and it's always stuck with me, and it is, justice is just us. And so just to put it in that frame of mind, I think that's, how we're really going to be able to make a difference, and that's how we've been able to make change, even though it's been a slow process as far as I'm concerned.
Dr. Dance, you want to jump in?
I agree with all that has been said. I would add that the Clinton administration's Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 added another layer. But yes, I would agree with Dr. Clark that it dates back to the 13th Amendment. And since then, we can map other legislative acts and presidential crime control acts that have added and legalized this prison industrial complex, this mass incarceration system.
I would add on that the prison industrial complex. So I think it's good that Dr. Dade mentioned Michelle Alexander. I also want to mention Ava DuVernay's film 13th because I think it does a really good job of laying that out as well. And I want to mention that Angela Davis talks about the prison industrial complex. I think she coined the phrase based on the phrase military industrial complex that was used by President Eisenhower to talk about his concern about how war was becoming a for-profit system. And Davis talked about how the relationship between incarceration and business, basically how prisons were becoming increasingly privatized as entities themselves as well as the associated goods and services. And as a result, they become, this for-profit industry of, and then we become addicted to it as, as a society. Those services, those goods and services are things that many people who are not incarcerated make money on, both corporations, multinationals, and small businesses. And even families of incarcerated individuals are forced in many ways to be a part of the commerce that is produced by this prison industrial complex.
One of the things that I read when I was preparing for the show that was shocking to me, I honestly had no idea. There was a statistic on the state of California, and it stated that it takes roughly $75,000 to house each inmate in the state of California per year. And it made the correlation between the cost to house the inmate versus attending Harvard, and that it's actually more expensive to house an inmate than it is to pay tuition at Harvard, but yet we're sending more people to prison than we are to college. And that was just staggering to me. And I said, I wonder if the marginalized and the disenfranchised that are falling victim to the mass incarceration problem, if they're even aware of just how pervasive this problem is. It's just staggering to me.
Yes, and I would agree. So, for example, in addition to that cost, we hear often this 2.3 million people incarcerated statistic. But when you look at everyone under correctional supervision, is more like 6.7 million. Wow. And then
did you say 6.7, Dr. Dane?
6.7 million, yes.
Wow.
Under some phase of correctional supervision. So that would be
and
parole.
Is that including adjudicated youth as well?
Yes. So probation, parole, local jail, prisons.
Any involvement with the justice system at all?
Yes. Wow. And under some phase of correctional supervision is the way it's defined. And also, when we think about the incarceration rate, to bring it down to something more that we can wrap our heads around, the U.S.'s rate is over like 650 plus people per 100,000, whereas in places like Scandinavia, it's less than 100, sometimes 50, 60 people per 100,000. So that's huge. That's a huge difference that the U.S. incarcerates 650 plus people per 100,000 people, larger than the Russian Federation, larger than Brazil, larger than South Africa. So,
because it is indeed a business.
Yes.
And I was going to say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Talk about the cost, but yet and still, we have to remember that there's little to no rehabilitation efforts with all the money that's being spent.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So education,
the recidivism rate
as it relates
is
to
extremely
college,
high.
is just not at the reach of those who are incarcerated.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Pitts.
No, go ahead, Dr. Clark, go ahead.
I was just going to pick up on your point about the $75,000 per year annual incarceration rate and the relationship between that and the cost of an Ivy League education, because that's a perfect segue to give folks some way to think intentionally about the school to prison pipeline, which again, it goes back to policies, in this case, educational policies that I would argue favor incarceration over education for specific groups of students, right? Specifically for students of color and students with disabilities, but also students who are sort of at the intersection of those two things. And when I say students with disabilities, I would say who have been identified as having a disability, but are often students that do not have disabilities, but have been disproportionately identified as having a disability, usually something in the realm of a behavioral disordered kind of diagnosis, which is often loosely and aggressively over-applied to kids of color, especially African-American boys and girls. And there's a lot of research right now. Monique Morris's book, Maisha Wynn's book, they're talking about how the school to prison pipeline now is in particular targeting African-American girls, also Latinx girls. And just to pick up on a point that Dr. Dance made is that, as a result of this, kids get pushed out of school. And then they get, if you get pushed into special ed, then that's a confinement setting, and then you get pushed out of school, right? So then you're excluded from school, but then that hastens the likelihood that you would get into these other confinement settings. So in some cases, people are now saying it's the school to confinement pipeline because you actually get confined long before you end up actually in prison. And I think it's I'll talk a little bit more later, I guess, when we start thinking about solutions, but it's not just it's how these educational policies also affect the way we prepare teachers and also the way that we organize and administer schools, right, that contribute to this. So it's not just sort of like the way that we think about it at the policy level, it's also the way that it happens and is enacted at the local level, even in the classroom.
Dr. Clark, you made a powerful point that I see day in and day out in my work as a therapist. Right now, my entire caseload is children, and when you talk about those restrictive environments, so you have this child that is presenting with behavioral problems, but clinically, we know that there's an emotional root that is fueling this behavior. There's some sort of trauma or something at play that is impacting this child's behavior and their inability to engage in pro-social behaviors in the learning environment. And what they're doing is they're funneling these children to, here in the tri-state area, we have A, B, C, and D settings. And then after the A, B, C, D settings, then we have the ICT placement. So as you move down the alphabet, the environments are becoming more and more and more restrictive. And the challenge with that, for example, depending on the ICT placement, those are secure care facilities that are educational right? But they're also, because they're addressing the behavioral and the mental health needs of the child, these are locked facilities. And then you have this social deficit that's not being addressed. So you have these children that are spending a good portion of their day, and in some instances their lives, in these restricted environments, and then you're putting them out into the community and they don't know how to function. I remember toward the middle of my career as a clinician, I was actually a therapist at a maximum security facility for adjudicated boys. And the recidivism rate was over 50%. It was a revolving door. I would say within 2 to 3 months, sometimes shorter than that, of the children being released, they were coming right back because there was no rehabilitation. There just weren't appropriate measures in place academically or behaviorally to prepare these children. You're incarcerating them, and then you're putting them right back into the same community with the same contextual variables that are adversely impacting them, and nobody's doing anything but preparing them to go to adult prisons, which is where many of them end up if they don't end up dead. So it's this vicious cycle that I believe comes down to dollars and cents. And that's tragic. Yeah. It's just tragic. So we know many, if not all of our listeners, particularly those of color, as we've touched on, have been impacted by mass incarceration in some capacity. And we want to hear from you. We want you to give us a call. You have, 3 amazing experts at your disposal tonight that are available to hear your comments, that want to address your questions. And you can call us live at 515-605-9744. Again, that's 515-605-9744. Now, we talked a little bit a few minutes ago. We started talking about the dollars and cents and the business aspect and what have you. And mass incarceration has crushing consequences, just crushing, racial, social, and economic. We spend around $270 billion per year on our criminal justice system. And back to the statistic in California, as I said, in California, it costs more than $75,000 per year to house each prisoner, more than it would cost to send them to Harvard. Mass incarceration exacerbates poverty and inequality, serving as an economic ball and chain that holds back millions, making it harder to find a job, access public benefits, and reintegrate into the community. I also want to add in, because we didn't say it, is that it makes it difficult to even find affordable housing. You have a criminal record, there's some places you just can't live. How difficult is it? I mean, how can you become positive, productive members of society when you can't find a job, you can't find any place to live, and you can't access other benefits that should be readily available to you? Mass incarceration is one of the major public health crises facing the United States, as the millions of people cycling through the courts, jails, and prisons, and as we said, even the juvenile detention facilities and the facilities for adjudicated youth, the detention centers, every year experience far higher rates of chronic health problems, substance use, mental illness than the general population. And we all know that each of those things make you that much more susceptible to being incarcerated. It's this vicious cycle. When we consider the far-reaching consequences of mass incarceration, what would you all say is the most important thing for us to know about the previously defined terms and why?
Well,
I'll just kind of step in, and I think that these are things that probably a lot of our listening audience is already aware of, but I don't think that it hurts to just to mention that, the voting rights are taken away. Just simple interstate or county travel, not to speak about passports for international travel, no longer accessible. And we also have to stop and think about how all of these things not only impact those who have been incarcerated, but the toll that it takes on families and friends, it's enormous.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I'd like...
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Professor Lory Dance. I'm an ethnographer, so I do a lot of work within schools, and I've worked with Black and Latino boys who tell stories of being criminalized when they're not criminals, of teachers not understanding sometimes. I wrote a book called Tough Fronts, The Impact of Street Culture on Schooling, where teachers aren't understanding that oftentimes the tough posture is a front. It's a front strategically engaged to be able to walk through dangerous places. It's not a career aspiration. And there are other researchers like Ann Ferguson's book, Bad Boys, Public Schools and the Making of Black Masculinity, came out in 2000, looking at how 11 and 12-year-olds are criminalized within the school system. So I think I would want people to understand that there are behaviors going on, there are misidentifications going on, and the kids who are misidentified and not understood are getting younger and younger every year. So now we speak to, it was alarming when Ann Ferguson was looking at 11 and 12-year-olds, and now we have the school to prison pipeline. There was a Yale Study Center report that looked at 132 preschool educators, having them watching videos and doing eye tracking technology, and they were told that the researchers were interested in challenging behavior. And so in these videos, there was a black boy, a white boy, a black girl, and a white girl, and the educators tended to cast challenging behavior upon black children, especially black boys, more so than and when in fact none of the children were actually engaging in challenging behavior. So, we have these behaviors. And the last book I'd like for people to consider, a book titled Punished, Policing the Lives of Black and Latino Boys, where Victor Rios is speaking about, he's also an ethnographer, he calls the youth control complex, in which there is a culture of criminalization. And it's not just the schools, it's coming also from law enforcement, from community and other institutions, that black and brown bodies are so criminalized that it's hard for them, they're corralled. It's hard for them to actually escape this hyper-criminalization. So I think it's important to understand the actions and behaviors that go into corralling young people into the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, and Dr. Dance, I wonder if I can just even add to, some of the work that you've mentioned, especially as we're looking at, some very fast growing rates as it relates to incarcerating females, both black and brown. And so one of the authors, there's a book that I have students reading and analyzing and discussing in a course that I teach called Adolescent Identity Development. And so the book is called Push Out. You probably heard about it, but it's the criminalization of black girls in schools. And it's a tough read, but it is a reality, and it just goes right along with the things that you've described as well, Dr. Dance.
Thank you. Yes.
Ladies, we have a caller. I'm going to go to the lines if you're okay with that. And Caller 5204, welcome to House Talk. What is your comment or question?
I'm not certain if that is me. Is it? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Using the basis of the Bible, which not everybody believes in the Bible. However, in Proverbs 22:6, it says, train up a child in the direction they shall go, and they shall not depart from it in adulthood. So given that, with the recidivism rate, when we start with children, given the microaggression, now they're learning that microaggression is a part of their world. And they become angry. They're not departing from it, which sets them up, in my belief, to be low-hanging fruit for the prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline system, whether they are black, brown, white. Now, we know that race does matter on the surface, because the microaggressions given to the black and the brown children are much more based on how teachers see them. So how do you, in teacher education, how can we actually start training teachers to see the eyes instead of seeing the skin? And, I should have let off. This is Marsha Harris, a previous student of UNLV in the CME department.
I guess I could jump in a little bit.
Yes.
Since the question focuses a little bit on how we're preparing teachers. So I was interested in sort of the idea that, maybe if some people believe in spare the rod, spoil the child, that in some ways they're actually maybe pre-preparing children for some kind of corporal punishment. And I think that that's an interesting question. It might be outside my scope to speak to that. But in terms of the question about 90% of public school teachers in the country are still white women, 90%. A lot of that percentage, the highness of that percentage, we can date back to Jim Crow era segregation and what happened when the Brown decision came forward, where the argument was that we were going to desegregate schools, and what we really did was schools stayed fairly segregated, but the teachers of color got pushed out, and white teachers became the majority in every public school, every private school, every K-12 school, and that's a problem that persists to this day. I absolutely agree that we need to do a much better job of preparing white teachers to engage with students who have different experiences and understandings of the world, experiences in and understandings of the world. But I don't agree that the answer is to see the eyes and not see the skin, because I think, that's really a form of colorblind racism. I think we need to be able to understand why attributes that we all have, whatever those attributes are important to who we are, and that we need to understand what they say about our experiences in the world and how we see ourselves, and understand that they make us who we are. And so I really think it's about learning to see people through a lens of a historical context, understanding racism, and not seeing people. I appreciate the sentiment, this idea that we should be able to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But I think that we have to be able to see people without putting value judgments on things like skin color, and that's the work of critical multicultural education. I don't know if either one of my colleagues want to jump in on that.
Actually, I'm writing a book chapter and an article right now in which I look at media discourses of young people, and I found that when someone like Caroline Giuliani, who shoplifted back in 2010 in Manhattan at Sephora, and she had like $300 in her pocket. This is, yes, the daughter of Rudolph Giuliani, and she shoplifted $100 worth of cosmetics. You can see how the discourse about what she did is humanizing and conveys complex humanity. Now compare her to Michael Brown, who didn't even shoplift, actually. And so when you look at the media discourses around him, there's no complex humanity. So I'm not saying that Caroline Giuliani doesn't deserve complex human discourse about who she is, like her parents were divorcing, it was a cry for help, and that sort of thing. That's what you see going on. I'm saying that all young people do, and you don't see that with young poor people, especially when poverty intersects with race. Adam Lanza, he's famous. He's Sandy Hook. He did the Sandy Hook shootings. When you look at discourses around him, again, there's this complex human presentation. And so what I would like to see teachers do is convey that same complex human interpretation to the behaviors of black and brown young people. A lot of times they haven't even committed a crime. That's the problem. But when they have, they don't get these complex human portrayals of who they are and why they did what they did. So,
when I was saying that to bring up a child in the direction in which they shall go and they shall not depart from it, it starts with a mentality. So not the spare the rod, spoil the child. It's like how they think, number one. I'm sorry for jumping back in, but I just wanted to clarify. And also, when I was saying to see the eyes are the mirror to the soul. And I would believe to teach people to rethink is a step two. You have to, when there is a situation of changing someone's mentality, to use the military as an example, you have to break them all the way down to build them back up. So I would believe to see an individual for their soul would be the first step that will allow them later on to see the different attributes that our children bring to school, regardless of what skin color they're wrapped in. And then we can look at their skin color and ask them about their experiences instead of judging based on their skin color. That's what I meant.
That makes a lot of sense.
The way that I address what you've mentioned clinically, I'm very big on trauma-informed care training for educators and really trying to learn more about ACEs and the impact of adverse childhood experiences, but training educators around ACEs, because what I find clinically, as I said, right now my entire caseload is children. So, having been a former educator as well as a clinician, being in and out of the schools, because I'm a mobile therapist, so I'm in schools every day. And what I'm realizing is it's a couple of things. There is a lack of cultural sensitivity among the majority of the educators that I encounter. But then there is a lack of awareness or at times even interest in understanding the experiences of these children. We know that children are coming into our learning environments today with levels of issues and challenges that perhaps surpass anything that they've ever come to school with in the history of mankind. And educators are just not appropriately equipped to be able to handle the complexity of the issues that these children are coming to school with. So it's very easy to scapegoat, to objectify, to demonize these children and just see them as a behavior problem without demonstrating the necessary sensitivity that they should have in order to be able to appropriately meet the needs of these children in the learning environment. And I think I get frustrated. Did you want to chime in?
I wanted to jump back in and just say, therefore adding to their mental despair, because they have no one that will understand them.
Right. You're absolutely correct. I go, we were talking a few moments ago about the restricted environments, right? And you have these children in the emotional support classrooms, and you have a school psychologist or a school counselor that sees a child for 15 to 30 minutes a month. Really? What might that accomplish when this child, when I look at my caseload and half of my caseload are in foster care. Right. So it's the complexity of the issues, and I feel like the school districts at the primary and the secondary level need to be deliberate and intentional in finding the resources and expanding their budgets to make this cultural sensitivity and this trauma-informed care training a mandate. Or else we're going to continue to see our children being funneled, as you said, into these more restricted environments, which is setting them up to fail. So, it's legislative. It is, we have another caller. It's a legislative issue. It's an issue at every level of academia, and we have, I believe that we have the ability to bring about change, but those of us that have the ability to access Congress, we need to be getting with these lobbyists, and we need to be reaching out to our legislators, and there has to be a change at the federal level that flows down to the state level to get these systems and measures in place as a mandate in order to be able to appropriately help our children. I'm going
to thank you very much.
Dr. Pitt, I wondered if I could just interject something quite quickly, because you mentioned ACEs, and I do appreciate the goal of ACEs, the framework that's used, the fact that it's much more holistic, but there are a number of criticisms with regard to that framework. And when we create new frameworks, we can always build upon those particular frameworks. And so just being more culturally centered, and I don't want to take up the time on that, but I do want to say that there are other models being created, and for us to consider those models that come closer to the needs specifically of brown and black children.
And I wanted to jump in on that too, and just suggest, I struggle a lot with the way in which even those of us who study this and do this work and are personally affected by it, also how the insidiousness of deficit narratives, and how those deficit narratives creep into our own consciousness, even as we do work to try to challenge these injustices, because they're just so prevalent and so pervasive in our society. And so, as much as trauma is a real thing, and intergenerational trauma, right, and historical grief and trauma, right, and as much as that is very, very real, there's a point at which, and I think actually Gloria Ladson-Billings was, the first person who I sort of learned to think critically about how sometimes certain sorts of terms or ideas, like the achievement gap, or this idea of historical grief and trauma, they become popularized, and then we sort of become seduced by them. And something that was originally intended to really unpack and expose and reveal, these disparities and injustices, they actually become used in ways that perpetuate them. And so I think it's important for us to blow them up. And Sean Ginwright has, I think in a very thoughtful way, talked about how we need to shift from this idea of trauma-informed care to healing-centered care, focusing on what our young people and the communities from whom they come that are being targeted by mass incarceration. So what do Black and Brown youth and what do Black and Brown communities, what do they bring as assets, right? And understanding and looking at them and the communities from which they come through an asset-driven lens, and how healing can emerge, from exactly that community cultural wealth, right? And those ways of knowing, the indigenous ways of knowing or cultural ways of knowing, and use that to guide solutions. And just in the same vein, I would also say that while there's a lot to critique about the ways in which white women in particular are behaving in public schools as teachers, and even how white men are behaving in public schools as educational leaders disproportionately, I really think that, that the burden needs to be placed on those of us who are in teacher preparation and educational leadership preparation, because we are not doing a good job. Teacher education, educational leader preparation. I mean, these are places where whiteness is pervasive, where attitudes about white supremacy live and breathe and gain new life every day, and it is extremely difficult to move people in those spaces. We ask a lot about why students of color aren't going into teaching in terms of diversifying the teacher pipeline. What we fail to ask, as one of my colleagues, Dr. Norma Maroon, has very astutely sort of unpacked, is, what are the factors that keep teacher education and educational leadership training so white? What are the factors that allow whiteness to persist in those educational spaces? So I just really want to force us to sort of unpack our own stuff, because I know that it's something that I have to fight in myself every day, to think through that asset lens.
Yeah.
Amen to that. I'm going to take the second caller. Caller 4409, welcome to House Talk. What is your comment or question? Good evening.
Babe.
Hello? Did you have a comment or question, sir? Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think most disturbingly, the justice system profoundly discriminates against people of color at every juncture, and we've talked about that quite a bit so far. African Americans are more likely to be stopped by the police, arrested, detained before trial, and given harsher sentences than whites. As a result, they are imprisoned at more than 5 times the rate of whites. In some states, this disparity is more than 10 to 1. For too long, we've tolerated this civil rights crisis. It is a civil rights crisis that has personally impacted my life as I reflect upon the countless family members and friends that have received harsher sentences than whites I know, who have comparatively received a slap on the wrist for the same, similar, or truth be told, much harsher crimes. When I think about, I believe it was Dr. Dance, when you commented on, the overall impact on the family. I was in first or second grade when my stepbrother went to jail and then ended up going to prison, and he didn't come home until I was in 9th grade. And the distance that we had to travel to go see him, and the difficulty that we had to go through, and traveling all over the state of New Jersey to see one of my uncles, my mom's brother, who, goodness gracious, I know he was moved probably to 4 or 5 different state prisons in the state of New Jersey, and cousins, and I mean, just endless issues. And it's been traumatic. It's been gut-wrenching. It has been heartbreaking. And to see, the aftermath of that when they've come home and the difficulty with the jobs and the housing and all of those things that come. And it leaves me in this place and space that I often find myself grunting in disbelief when I hear about white offenders who walk away with minimal and at times no jail time for offenses people of color would be put under the jail for. As a matter of fact, I want to add that I find too often people who see or hear about our credentials, those of us that are on the show tonight, and they think that our accomplishments somehow shield us from the impact of something so complex and taxing as incarceration, having a loved one incarcerated, or perhaps ourselves having been incarcerated. I don't know about each of you ladies, but I've been incarcerated, and it was a horrific experience. So I want to get a little bit personal right now, and I want to ask, if you're willing, what, if any, personal connections do you have to this topic, and how, if at all, has this topic impacted your personal lives as well as your academic and activist lives? Dr. Dance, if it's okay, we'll start with you, and then Dr. Clark and Dr. Dade, please share any personal impact as well as you use this space to expound upon the 25th hour. And please, Dr. Dade, share with our listeners how and where they can purchase the 25th hour as well.
Certainly will.
Okay, well, yes, thank you. I've been a Miss Goody Two-Shoes pretty much all my life, but it made my research with kids who have to navigate street culture even more interesting, and I was always very honest about my Miss Goody Two-Shoes stance. But in hanging out with them, especially when I was in graduate school and had on a hoodie, I was there when police rolled up on them when they were doing nothing. And I was taking notes and I was trying to see what would happen. And I've also done work in prisons. I'm teaching right now in a prison with some young men between 19 and 40 who are looking to get college credit, and how, these are human beings. These are very complex people. But I also have an uncle who was a Mr. Goody Two-Shoes, if there was such a thing, Harvard MBA graduate. And he is currently incarcerated for a murder he did not commit.
Oh, my goodness.
And that is just, now it makes me realize that I could also be incarcerated for something that I didn't do, or for something that I did do but deserved more leniency, because I have learned from my uncle's situation how aggressive prosecution works. And so I've been looking into books like Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration, by John Pfaff. I don't know, it's Pfaff is the last name, where you find that 95% of cases end up with a defendant pleading guilty due to aggressive prosecution. And the 5% of people who go to trial, the prosecutors will do things like pad the jury. Prosecutors against the Brady v. Maryland Supreme Court decision in 1963, which states that that the prosecutors must hand over favorable evidence to the defense. Prosecutors don't do this. They engage in trial by ambush. They add statements not provided by the witness. I mean, the prosecutor in my uncle's situation literally during trial added a statement that wasn't anywhere, that didn't come from any witness. And then prosecutors are not held accountable for misconduct. And I think there was one case in which a prosecutor Ken Anderson, was held accountable for withholding evidence that led to an innocent man being imprisoned for 25 years. And the prosecutor who was held accountable, I think he served like 10 days or something. So this is it's really painful. As I sat in my uncle's trials, I thought I was in the 1950s. I mean, literally, there were moments when I wanted to scream out, "Are you, excuse my language, effing serious?"
Right.
Because of just what was going on, and the judge was like allowing the prosecutor to act aggressively, and this man, and the only thing they had was circumstantial evidence. Yeah. And even though the eyewitness said that the person that he witnessed committing the murder saw a white man in his 40s, my uncle is a brown-skinned man. He's not even light-skinned, in his 70s. So these things, the prosecutor just overlooked them. So yes, it's very personal to me. It was personal before my uncle was incarcerated, but now I'm starting to see things. Maybe Dr. Pitts, you can even speak to the nitty-gritty, the ins and outs, the nuances, the inequities, hugely happening.
Yeah. We have the caller that disconnected called back. Do you want me to go to the line and take that caller, or do you want to keep moving and then we get him on the tail end of your response to this question? I'll follow your lead, whatever you prefer.
It may be good just to keep the consistency of the question intact.
Okay.
To be able to finish responding.
Okay. Go right ahead.
Dr. Day, why don't you go ahead, and then I just have something quick to bring up the end of the conversation.
Okay. Well, I definitely have a lot of personal. I know that Dr. Pitts, you mentioned just the countless number of family members, as well as friends with, and I'm really kind of focusing on the younger generation that's being incarcerated right now. So I have a lot of that. But in addition to that, I have a son, and that son actually, Christopher Donaldson Jr., is the author of The 25th Hour. And so just to kind of give a little bit of background on that, in his very early 20s, he was given a 32-year to life sentence for a crime that he wasn't present at. And this goes to a number of the things that Dr. Dance has spoken about as far as those nitty-gritty pieces, right? And so after an 8-year period of being incarcerated, we were able to appeal this because of legislation changing in California. And I just have to kind of share that legislation, those legislation changes came about from the pressures of those who are committed for change in this particular area. So even people like John Legend, who really leads the way as a celebrity, has helped to lobby and to get some of these laws changed. And it was through that we were able to go back to court after 8 years, and in July, the judge ordered an immediate release. However, he still has not been released, and so we're working on that. And it just takes too long to get into all of the details, but the impact that has had on him, and I talked about that earlier, the impact on family, for all the reasons that have been mentioned, it's just tremendous. It's even difficult to even put those things into words. I would like to just take a minute, and hopefully if we have time in the show, I want to be able to, the way of Chris being able to make it through was his writing ability. And so it was so powerful. I was receiving all of these poems. It was very therapeutic for him, but they were poems that I felt could be shared with not only the folks who are incarcerated to be able to get books to them, but more so our outside community, because this is a forgotten population, especially as it relates to, our youth that are incarcerated in this prison. And so to hear it from someone who is incarcerated, I think is really important. And that's why I didn't speak as much, because I wanted to be able to not only share his point of view, but to share just a couple of the powerful poetry. He had 65 different poems in this book, but I'm just going to share, first of all, his gratitude for having this show. He said, "Hello. I first want to thank my mother and support system for bringing this book to life. Being incarcerated can stifle the soul to a point where one may not believe they can bring any of their dreams to fruition. This collection of poems that eventually morphed into a book called The 25th Hour started as a coping mechanism, as a way to remove myself, if only for a moment, from the reality of incarceration, to a place where I could analyze life, love, future, past, and in more abstract, to a place where I could be my true self again and project optimism even when reality seemed very bleak. I hope to shed light on the talents that have been locked away, never to be utilized without a spark of hope from outside sources. Mass incarceration is real, as well as the process of dehumanization that accompanies it via prison staff, police, district attorneys, judges, and the rest of the justice system. So thank you so much for your time and your continued support." And so that was from him, and I promised to read it during the show. And so, Christy, I don't know if you want to kind of pick up on that, because we have a special link, Dr. Clark and I, as it relates to Chris. And then I would definitely like to read a couple of short poems, and that can wait till after the caller is able to speak as well.
I appreciate that, Karen, Dr. Dade. I will just say that it's a good segue, because as a person who grew up white and middle class, were it not for my vicarious association with people of color in my life, I wouldn't have any of these kinds of experiences at all. I wouldn't have any personal connection to the issue of mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, because as a white middle class person, I had no experience with any of these things in my life during my formative years. In fact, I had positive experiences interacting with law enforcement. I got stopped and let go, for even when I did something, I got stopped and let go. And so I think that it's a powerful contrast to look at the relationship between race and class and these experiences that we share, even though we're all, women in academia who are well educated and successful professionally. So, and I also will just say that the other ways in which I'm connected to the school to prison pipeline are because of things that I sought out, things that I chose to do, like teach in prisons or to work with quote unquote at risk or at promise youth, not because of things that happened to me really or to my family. And to the extent that anything has happened to my family, it's been the exception to the rule rather than the rule. And I think that that's super important to point out. And so probably the most significant relationship that I have is with Karen's son, Christopher, who I've known since he was probably like 2 or 3 years old, and have been writing to for the last, 8 to 10 years, maybe not quite that long, but I've been writing to him on a regular basis to ensure that when he gets out, that to the extent possible, that his emotional, psychological, intellectual, and physical well-being is as strong as possible. And also because I know how hard it is for my longtime friend, my sister Karen, to have to cope with him being in prison. And so it's part of how I also try to love and support her. But it's an extraordinarily painful thing, and everything that I thought I knew about these experiences, has been amplified 100 times by virtue of my very close and prolonged, connection with Chris and with Karen because of the situation. So I think that's really important for especially white folks that may be listening, or people who are especially white folks with economic and educational privilege, to understand that we don't have these experiences, but many of our professional colleagues do.
Can I ask a quick question of Dr. Dade? So, my uncle was arrested in, it was around late July 2017. He was convicted in August 2018. And his appeal was denied in August 2019. And so it's been a couple of years, not as long as you have had to deal with this. And so I get back from the summer, and my colleagues like, "How was your summer?" And that they just have no understanding of this outrageous situation. And some of my colleagues, Chris, even though Chris Clark isn't here with me in Nebraska, she's here with me because I call her all the time. But many of my colleagues are not like Dr. Clark. And so I've been being more and more public about my uncle's situation as I strive to fight it. His name is Bernard Duse, D-U-S-E. But Dr. Dade, so how do you handle the kind of more public interface around the incarceration of a loved one?
Well, I have to say, Dr. Dance, when he received this 32 to life sentence, I had asked the judge to speak on his behalf and on behalf of our family. And, with much going back and forth, he allowed me to be able to do that. Now, I didn't know that there were reporters in the courtroom. And so it made national news that an associate dean's son had received a sentence of 32 years to life. And so, not even realizing that happened, the president of my university knocked on my office door, and I'm wondering, what the heck is he knocking on my door for, right? And he came in with an apology, as well as letting me know that this university, that he and this university would stand by me. That helped me tremendously to become public with what was happening. I had no choice. It was out there anyway. And the idea of coming up with the book, that gave me the wherewithal to say this is so important, not only for my son, but for other youth, because this legislation is geared toward those who received these heavy sentences in their early 20s. It only went up to the age of 23, this legislation. So if you were convicted between, the age, or at least up to 23, that you would have this opportunity for appealing. And this is just very recent that it happened. So I don't know if I answered, your question, Dr. Dance, to the point of just getting into more detail, but I wanted you to know just that initial piece of what happened. And so now what we've done is we've taken that book. Not only does Dr. Clark use that book in a course that she's teaching on school to prison pipeline, my university uses that book in their classrooms. We go around the country doing book club socials with women book clubs who ask for us to come. We donate the proceeds in part to the Book for Prisoners nonprofit organization because they don't allow these books to go into the system, but that particular organization does have an inroad to be able to do that. So we're getting a lot of people engaged in hearing the voice of our youth that are incarcerated through this book. And that's kind of my way of being able to cope, make a difference, and keep my son encouraged through this process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. I'm going to go to the line real quick. Caller 4409, welcome to House Talk. What is your comment or question? Hello? Okay.
Sorry, we talked too much.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
No, they were there. I'm not sure if they're having difficulty with their line or I don't know.
Okay.
And it's okay. So, Dr. Dade, you were going to share some of Chris's poems.
Yeah, I'm actually going to start with the poem titled 25th Hour.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a short poem, so let's go to that.
Okay.
And this is also on audio, and so just sometimes I just listen to it, the poetry. As my mind relaxes and bodily movements become stoic, I liberate myself by enjoying life at the present moment. To think you would need what you never had is utterly insanity, as are the conveniences of our modern materialistic humanity. I'll admit that I've fallen short and point to where I haven't succeeded, though I believe growth is defined by those mistakes that we've not repeated. One physical life to live, at the finale, the source will be our judge. I pray for mercy, forgiveness for these sins now way too much. Our time in this world seems to pass way too quick. Only the unknown left to face, so I readily submit. The will of my own, all-encompassing power that will call us home on that 25th hour. And I think this book, it has sections where he talks about love, he talks about consciousness, and so I'm really just kind of focusing right now on the things that he's talking about as it relates to the system. And so, system of justice. Imagining being falsely accused when with all of your heart you know you're in the clear. Having to sit through a trial and be judged by a jury of your so-called peers. At every single turn, the prosecution raises errant objections, only so your jury can't have the chance to digest your lawyer's suggestions. When this kind of corruption underlies our system of justice, how can honest citizens be expected to wholeheartedly trust it? thought the trial would be focused completely on the alleged facts, came to realize the plan was to judge me based on my distant past. Stick to black and white. Let's please not deter it. Then maybe I can get an honestly unbiased verdict. Please consider the full scope of the arguments before reaching a conclusion, because all that the most skillful courtroom operators paint amount to illusions. The tension is built while waiting an entire lifetime through deliberation. As court is called to session, both my palms are covered in perspiration. The nervous anticipation surrounds me as the foreman rises, and from the slip of paper reads, defendant is innocent on all charges. Allow him to please be immediately freed. And if you have time for one more, I can do one more.
Please.
This one is titled Misery's Cradle. Experiencing the most gut-wrenching, powerful pain, not physically, but self-imposed through the brain. What remedy is there to deal with this type of anguish, besides praying with your heart that all of this would vanish? Giving up hope and leaving prematurely is considered both cowardly and selfish, especially when thoughts of certain things still leave your heart melted. At what point do you have to digest and just accept your doom? Your growth stunted as a seed that has not had a chance to bloom. As happiness begins to die out, your whole being feels hollow. The mind thinks only repetitive thoughts while the body just follows. With a rare conscious thought, you can't remember when you laughed or cried. Awakening every morning knowing that nothing will be different from the last 1,000 nights. Then people you care about most start forgetting to put up that facade that they still care. Reaching the point now where the cross is getting harder and heavier to bear. Out of the embers of the inferno, your pain gradually begins to recede. Then you awaken in cold sweats, realizing that all of the memories weren't a dream.
Dr. Dade, so I'm a big old crybaby.
Yeah.
And
I'm trying to hold the tears back as I'm reading. That's why we had a professional reader actually do the audio.
I am humbled. I'm honored that Chris encouraged you to share. I just cannot even imagine. But I publicly applaud your strength, your resilience, and your faithfulness and advocacy, and you and Dr. Clark as well, and his strength to truly embody what it means to turn the adversities of his life into opportunities for other people. This is, through what appears to be the most trying time of his life, to write with that magnitude of passion and authenticity, knowing that, yes, it's a release for him, but that it's medicine for someone else's soul who is perhaps going through the same thing that he's going through. I applaud you as a mother, because that is true character. I'm blown away. I am just absolutely blown away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pitts.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
I think about Chris. He became a father at 19, and as I said, at 21, he was locked away from his child, and he writes a poem even about being a father that I think relates to a lot of our young people who are in prison, both male and female, who have children on the outside, and they want to be able to send them a message of love and understanding. And so I don't know if we have time, I would read that, but if not, I just wanted to kind of plug that in, as well. That it's beyond him. It touches all of our lives. It's a part of our families and our family and communities and how we're impacted. So I too am grateful for his tenacity to be able to do this work.
What I would like to ask you is, in the instance of time, we have about 24 minutes left. So I want to jump in and move on expeditiously, but at the very end, I would like for you to share that additional poem, if you would, please, ma'am.
Be wonderful.
I think that he's earned that right, and I'll give that space. I know that Dr. Clark has a flight to catch, so I'm trying to be mindful of the time. But I will definitely give space for that. And we've got a couple more callers. And callers, I thank you so much for waiting patiently. I will try to get to you, I promise, but we're going to move on a little bit because we've got a wealth of additional information we want to make sure we get out. The politics and crime, the politics of crime and punishment have changed fundamentally, and I think you all have alluded to that to some degree tonight, in ways hard to imagine in an earlier era. Today, polls show widespread support for a less punitive approach. One incendiary moves such as marijuana legislation or an end to the death penalty are finding political success and rising popularity. In red, blue, and purple states, lawmakers are beginning to respond and act. Earlier this year, Emily Bazelon from Random House expounded upon a spring 2019 issue of the American Prospect magazine on an article entitled "The Road to Ending Mass Incarceration Goes Through the DA's Office." She writes, and I quote, "Prosecutors have always been key players in criminal justice, especially in America, where their powers are subject to little oversight. But today their control of case outcomes is unmatched and largely unchecked, as you all have just stated, right? Prosecutors bring charges, propose bail, shape plea deals, and specify penalties with little effective resistance from defense attorneys, grand juries, or even judges. This statement speaks volumes, and I know that we've touched on this a little bit, so if each of you, if you want to briefly just sort of expound on this a little bit, and then we can move on. What is the impact of aggressive prosecutors on mass incarceration, and is this overzealous prosecution really what clinically we call a reframe for prosecutorial misconduct? Do you have anything you want to add on this?
I stated some of the things, this is Dr. Dan, that I want to say, and the role that it plays, that they play. I think we could all, if you haven't seen When They See Us, with Exonerated 5, also known as the Central Park 5, you can see actions of overzealous prosecutorial conduct in the behaviors of Linda Fairstein and Elizabeth Lederer and the others. If you want a shorter version, I would encourage people to go to their computer, go to YouTube, and type in John Oliver, prosecutors. Last week tonight, he did this wonderful segment in light on prosecutorial misconduct. Okay. And then the one thing I'll quickly add about my uncle's situation is he's an all-white jury. In 2008, 2018. And the way that the prosecutor presented there weren't, I mean, we're talking about Fauquier County, Virginia, so it wasn't a lot of choice, but they used so-called neutral reasons to take people out of the pool. And so I watched that happening before my eyes. He got an all-white jury in 2018.
Wow.
And that was prosecutorial involvement in that.
And just to jump on that a little bit, since Dr. Dance also did a guest speaking engagement in my School to Prison Pipeline class this semester, I asked her to come and speak about her uncle's case, and as a sociologist to talk about how she might frame the idea of the School to Prison Pipeline. And she raised this question of prosecutorial misconduct, and I asked my students if they could think of ways that prosecutorial misconduct shows up in some other, like we would call it something else, but are there ways in which this notion of aggressive prosecution or misconduct, right, by the folks that are making decisions about what happens to young people in schools, does it show up in their schools? And they couldn't come up with examples fast enough, right? So there was many ways that that the students in my class who are public school teachers in Clark County, Nevada, could see examples of aggressive behavior and misconduct behavior on the parts of teachers and school officials that end up having the same effect on students of color through the school to prison pipeline in the form of zero tolerance policies or overly punitive discipline, suspension, expulsion, and things like that. So I think that it's just important to make that connection between what's happening in schools and then how it shows up in the prison system.
Dr. Dade, did you want to add anything before we move on?
No, I think that they just did an eloquent job just really pointing out those facts.
So at long last, a vibrant public conversation is at least supposedly underway. A 2015 Brennan Center publication, Solutions, American Leaders Speak Out on Criminal Justice, offered proposals from a bipartisan array of elected officials and advocates and helped move criminal justice reform to the center of the 2016 election. Since then, the nationwide consensus in favor of a new direction has only hardened. For the first time, the opportunity for truly transformative change is in view. Within the context of transformative change, what is restorative justice?
I can jump in unless somebody else wants to go first.
Go right ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Clark.
Sure. I think it's important to talk a little bit about, so it's like one of those other terms I was talking about before, like the achievement gap, right? Is that it has become, unfortunately, kind of like flavor of the month, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have deep, profound, and powerful roots. It really does. It's just that it's been a lot of the ways that we see it show up in society today has kind of ripped it from those roots. That's how I would describe it. So I think restorative justice has great potential. I think it really depends on whose example or whose model of restorative justice is being used and in what context. You think about sort of where it came from. It really has a long tradition in indigenous communities, especially our Aboriginal communities in Canada and New Zealand, Australia, and in the U.S. as well. So it really comes from Aboriginal views of justice and Aboriginal teachings about justice. And then I think from there it's also been adapted by faith communities, by prison abolitionists like the critical resistance movement, and then also alternative dispute resolution folks. But it's really about relationships, right? So it starts with what are the relationships that people have, and then when there's a breach of relationship, how do we return? How do we restore? those relationships, but it's not situated in an individual, right? It's not situated in this rugged individualism that we have in the West, which I think is part of why we struggle with implementing it as a concept in criminal justice and in school discipline, because it's really situated in family and community. It's situated in the collective. And until we start to think about solutions through a collective, not through like the individual person who is perceived to have committed a crime and then the person that has been on the receiving end of the crime, until we start to see it sort of like how Khalil Gibran talks about, that this happens, the situation that we're talking about happens because of the silent will of all of us. Until we're willing to understand the community responsibility, I don't know how effective restorative justice can be in a larger sense. But I think if we look at it through local level relationship building and creating spaces where there can be trust, and through trust, fair and just practices, then when there are breaches to those conditions, we can use restorative justice practices to return to those relationships that trust and that sense of justice. And I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the best way I have to describe it.
Yeah, and I would add that, as you said, rugged individualism is not a part of restorative justice. As healing circles operate, members of the community are all seen as vital, important, not people to be thrown away. And so I actually use, on a small scale, and to come back to what Dr. Clark was saying, restorative justice in my classes. It's usually with my freshmen, but not necessarily, because it can happen with older students too. Well, they'll do something, just like some knucklehead something that really goes against the student code of conduct, disrupting class in some way, being disrespectful to TAs. So I had this happen, and before I did anything extreme, I enacted restorative justice. I called the students in question and spoke with each one of them individually, got their side of the story, helped them to understand why this was a breach of the student code of conduct. And instead of reporting them to some higher body in the university, I had them apologize. And so, because I saw these students, and the one main student in question was a young black male student, but not necessarily is it a young black male student, but in this case it was, and I understood how the university would treat him, that he wouldn't be given extra opportunities. And so, and with the explanation, with the one-on-one, with the, you are important to this class. I really want you to be a part of this class. Your voice is important. Your experiences are important. You seem to not to understand the seriousness of the class, and that this is college, not high school, although I hope you didn't behave that way in high school. But in this one-on-one conversation, telling him how important he was, he agreed. He apologized to me. He apologized to the teaching assistants. And that, I mean, that in a very small way is a restorative justice approach. And it's always my go-to when I have a student behaving problematically.
You know, and I don't, think that I think the local level work is powerful. And I also think we have to embrace national work as well. I was happy to hear Obama in a speech recently just really trying to express the importance of the black vote. But in that speech, he really impressed upon the audience the importance of coming together in a national collective way to address mass incarceration. And so when you have, speakers of that caliber sending those messages, I think that too is very important. I mean, there's just so many different pieces to this that's actually going to help to just reinforce or to enforce the changes that we desire in this. Because right now, even for new legislation, I couldn't believe it, that the very legislation that I talked about just coming about it in the last year, they're already trying to dismantle that. And so because we had, 100 new judges put into place around the country, all of these things are very deliberate to keep the status quo in place. So there is this need, I think, for us to have some national consciousness and push the buttons that are needed to keep the changes that have been made, but continue to to build upon them. So I think, again, all levels are important in this work as far as restorative justice is concerned.
That is actually a good segue into when you talk about the legislative piece, because last year Congress took a step forward by overwhelmingly passing the bipartisan First Step Act. It shortened some of the most extreme federal drug sentences and expanded programming for incarcerated people. But in recent years, we've also seen the country's leadership take grave steps back, from expanding immigration detention to reinstituting draconian federal charging policies. The First Step Act, which needs to be fully funded and implemented, will not fix our deeply broken system. But with both Democrats and Republicans committed to reform, it represents a new baseline. This breakthrough shows it's possible to make even bigger changes, and that the politics can align to abolish mass incarceration. Bearing this in mind, I know, Dr. Clark, you touched on it very briefly. We've got 9 minutes. Bearing this in mind, what is prison abolition and how could it work?
So just real quick, I would encourage people to look at Angela Davis' book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Because she's asking people to consider prison abolition by asking us to recognize that incarceration is not effective. It has been efficacious in solving whatever problems people think that it is supposed to solve. It doesn't do that. And so the idea of prison abolition is to eliminate prisons and focus on rehabilitation, not on discipline and punishment. There's a lot of people that, kind of freak out about that. They talk about the resistance to this is about what always comes up, the Holy Trinity. What do you do with murderers, child molesters, and rapists? But there's so many nonviolent offenders in prison that could be released immediately. And if we start the conversation, if we can imagine a different way, then we can bring it into being. And we start with nonviolent offenders, we start with prevention, not cure. We start with, strategies for rehabilitation. And I would just call on my mentor, who always says that it's not that we don't know how to do it, it's that we don't have the will to do it.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
I would also add to that, and Dr. Clark, you can also add to this, is that we have to really be against private prisons.
Exactly.
Right? According to the Sentencing Project, U.S. private prisons incarcerated 121,718 people in 2017, and this is only, at this point, 8.2 of the total state and federal prison population, but this number is up since 2000, such that there's been a 39% increase in the number of people housed in private prisons. And if we're going to make incarcerating people profitable, it's not going to go to removing or having other solutions. So I'd love to hear what both of my what all three of you think about that, private prisons.
I mean, I think that you said it all. You said it all, right?
Thumbs down.
If it's profitable, it's going to be hard to get rid of.
Right. Comes down to the dollars and cents.
Unless we change our definition of what does it mean, what is profit, right? Because I often have tried to make the case that I believe that the cure for cancer is in the mind of a man who sits on death row, right? Or right, the cure for diseases that have plagued, society or humankind for hundreds of years is locked in the mind of a woman, right, who sits on death row, and we failed them educationally. And because we failed them educationally, we also fail society because we don't benefit from their gifts. So if we can reframe how we understand profit, maybe that's the way that we change the will.
And I know it's a hard thing to even think about. I think about the fact that, you have private ownership of prisons that people can actually invest into. It's a Wall Street commodity. Right. And so when there's so much profit going on, and this is what we struggle with so many things as it relates to justice, what will it take?
Well, we certainly know that federal policy matters. While the vast majority of the nation's prison population is held in state facilities, what happens at the federal level sets the stage for the rest of the nation. Federal reforms can spur national culture change to end mass incarceration, and federal incentive funding can help states to decarcerate and provide support for innovative new ideas. So now what's the next step? We need stronger, more comprehensive, and more far-reaching solutions from our nation's leaders to address mass incarceration. It would be a missed opportunity to aim for anything less than fundamental change. As we consider fundamental change and prepare to close, if each of you could please share 1 to 2 key points or resources that we want our listeners who might want to learn more to take away from tonight's discussion. And Dr. Dade, please don't forget to let everybody know how they can get the 25th hour. Dr. Clark, because we know you have to get ready to jump off.
For that piece.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll go quick,
Dr. Clark,
and then
Dr. Dade, Dr. Dade. Yep.
I'll go quick, and then I'll let you all close without me, and I'll be with you in spirit as I head to the airport. So the things that I would like people to take away, the keys for the key ring, as you mentioned, Dr. Pitts. I think my colleague, Dr. Dade, mentioned it early in the show, but this idea that people in prison, we have to think of them as among us. Otherwise, we forget them because they're invisible. Policy and law will not do the work for us. We have to work the policies and the laws. That should be a takeaway from the Brown decision. And that we need to build from and at the grassroots level. And then 2 slightly longer points. One from a book called Why Are There So Many Minority Kids in Special Education by Jeanette Klingner and Beth Harry. What I take away from that book is that the good news is that if teachers do not refer students for suspension or for special education, they almost never get suspended or go to special education. So we have a lot of power. First of all, teachers have a lot of power to interrupt the school to prison pipeline if they just don't refer kids, but it also means that in teacher education, we have to work on helping pre-service teachers and through professional development in-service teachers to build stronger classroom management and pedagogical practices so that they can engage students in those restorative practices that Dr. Dance was talking about in her classroom as an alternative to referring them out. Right? That's, I think, really powerful that we at the local level can make different decisions and build skills that can change this in radical ways. And then the last thing I just want to call upon Audre Lorde's quote, where she talks about the institutionalized rejection of difference is an absolute necessity in a profit economy, which needs outsiders as surplus people. As members of such an economy, we have all been programmed to respond to human difference between us with fear and loathing and to handle that difference in one of 3 ways. Ignore it, and if that is not possible, copy it if we think it is dominant, or destroy it if we think it is subordinate. But we do not have patterns for relating across our human difference as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in service of separation and confusion. And so to to build on her idea, I say we need to build patterns for relating across our human difference as equals. And I think to some extent, our very first caller, Marcia Harris, was kind of trying to get us at that. I think it's only with these patterns for relating across our human difference can we work together to meaningfully interrupt and dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, and to stop mass incarceration.
Yeah, well said.
And I would like to thank you, Dr. Clark.
Yes.
I'm wishing you traveling grace and mercy. Safe travels.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark.
Thank you all.
And I will see you tomorrow at the conference.
See you. Love you, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
And I just want to add to what Dr. Clark just said, and my message would be to teachers, because I'm both a college professor and an ethnographer who works in middle school and high schools. Avoid engaging in confirmation bias. And that's when you see kids doing something problematic and you only look at the stuff that confirms the conclusion that you've made. Instead, also look at disconfirming evidence. And there's a lot of studies. You can just Google confirmation bias. You can Google confirmation bias and disconfirming evidence and look for reputable sources. Don't just believe the first things you pull up. Psychologists write things about this. Other social scientists do as well. And that's pretty much what I do, because kids in my classes and kids in the schools that I work in as an ethnographer can definitely rub me the wrong way. But I don't give in to that first impression, because I'm like, these are young people. They're very complex. Let me just very quickly, in less than a minute, tell a story about a kid that was in the 7th grade who had to do a science project, and he was living in a shelter at the time with his maternal aunt, and his teacher didn't believe he was capable of doing the science project. He didn't have what other kids took for granted, which were guardians that could help him do the project because his maternal aunt was illiterate. So a tutor actually stepped in and gave him the support he needed, do the science project, allowed him to videotape it in a university lab with a microscope, and the kid came to life. He did the research, and he presented it, and the teacher was wowed. But initially, she had only looked at the confirmation bias that he was incapable of doing the project, whereas the tutor looked at the ways in which was there disconfirming evidence about that. And I think that too many teachers and other school officials, because they themselves are overwhelmed, they have so many kids, and they don't have the adequate support that they need, but simply avoid going to that space of confirming what you believe to already be true without looking at disconfirming evidence. Always look for disconfirming evidence.
That's good. Dr. Dade?
Yeah, well, I am really just loving the opportunity to be in so many different settings and sharing the book. And we actually read the poetry. We, give critical responses to that. We talk about ways in which we can be of assistance. And so with that being said, and especially we have a women's empowerment network as a part of the MIDC. MIDC stands for Multicultural International Development Company. And so we have several components to that, and one of the components is that Women's Empowerment Network. And it's been the Women's Empowerment Network that we've been doing these small 25 to 30 women who are meeting on this particular topic. And we know as women ourselves, I mean, we are strong, we are the nurturers, and we certainly have such wonderful things to bring to all forms of change as it relates to justice. And I think specifically in this area, because we are the mothers of our children who are being incarcerated. So that's been a very powerful entity as I look toward, ways in which we can continue to strengthen the work in this particular area. And so I'm going to give a shout out to how to purchase the 25th Hour book. We actually have it. We did not put it on Amazon. Amazon generally will take, 50 to 70% percentage of the royalties. And so because we're focused on being able to get this book to those who are incarcerated and to youth programs who can, actually use this in after-school centers, et cetera, and so on. So we've actually, the purchase of this book actually runs through the MIDC website. And so I'll give that website address, and then all of the information is right there. You can order the book. You can actually schedule, to have presentations or the book club idea as well. And so that is MIDCLLC.com. And I'm also going to give a number of the company for which, if you want to follow up and give us a call, we'd love to hear from you as well. That telephone number is 360-441-4544.
Can you say that number one more time, please?
360-441-4544.
Dr. Dade, we have 9 minutes. If you could go ahead and share that last poem that you wanted to share, and then I will go ahead and close us out.
Okay. All right. Sounds wonderful. And then I'm glad I'm reading this poem last. It comes out of the youth, the love theme of the book, and it's called Proud to be a Father. I was told that nothing could ever trump the relationship of mother and son. Being that the bond is the strongest type, a completely indestructible one. It should be able to endure any and every kind of pressure. But relationships are like birds, meaning not all flock together. Truthfully, I pray that the sins of the father don't follow the one that carries his torch. Because if that's to be believed, then all of us are likely to be unduly cursed. The love of a mother is supposed to be one of life's bare essentials. Without it, can we possibly reach the peak of our potential? Blessed I am with a son that is a spitting image of his father, loving all my responsibilities of being your protector, guider, and provider. So, son, I won't wonder about how much you need a mother's love anymore because you hold the entirety of my heart. I think that might even the score. I can't judge, though. Love is said to come in many shapes and forms. Your dad will be there in the sunniest weather and the darkest of life's storms. Nothing will ever change my love for you regardless of how challenged. With the love from God, our family, and me, I promise the scales will be balanced. We have a cross to bear, so just focus on being the best you. Faith and ambition will guide you through whatever you want to do. From this life until the next, I'll always be there. So depend on your dad and let the love do the rest.
Absolutely beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I want to first apologize because we still have callers sitting in queue. So I do apologize, callers, that we did not get to you. Please feel free to share your comments or questions. You can email me at lauren@drlaurendpitts.com. I will make sure that your questions or comments get forwarded to all of the guests on the show tonight. You can also contact me via Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Same thing at my name, Dr. Lory D. Pitts, and I will make sure that our guests tonight are made aware of your questions and or comments with a way to contact you to respond accordingly. So please, please, please forgive me. We had a wealth of information that we needed to cover tonight, and we just didn't have the opportunity to take all the calls. So I just wanted to add as we're closing out that in advance of the 2020 presidential election, we need our leaders representing communities most harmed by mass incarceration, as well as top policymakers to offer their solutions. As Dr. Clark stated before she left, the legislative piece is very, very important. But in addition to that, we each need to be doing our parts as well. So we want to continue to do our part to urge our legislators to think big. We want to make sure that we're taking appropriate action to get the legislative changes that we need. It is paramount that you exercise your right to vote. To all of my esteemed guests tonight, thank you, thank you, thank you. There aren't words. Dr. Dade, I am letting you know right here and now, please, please, please share with Chris my heartfelt gratitude for you sharing his testimonial, his resilience, his strength, and please let him know that I welcome the opportunity to interview him on a future show once he comes home and gets settled. Please make sure he has my contact information. I will give space to him to share his testimonial, his journey, and what next steps are for him as he overcomes this ordeal, and to really go deeper into the 25th hour and how he anticipates it being a tremendous blessing to people, which I know that it absolutely will. Thank you so, so very much to each of you, and just my heartfelt gratitude for the amazing work that you're doing. I learned so much. I tell you, I was like, I don't even feel as smart as them. There's so much more work that I have to do. But you all have been such a tremendous blessing and an encouragement to me as I continue the work that I'm doing clinically in working with our youth and the educators in preparing them to not contribute to putting our children in the system, but contributing to educating them and empowering them and healing them. So just thank you for the work that you're doing. And you truly embody the each one, reach one. So thank you for simply being you, for helping me to make this episode of House Talk as impacting and life-transforming as I truly believe this episode will be. And listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we hope that we are making a difference in your lives, your homes, and your communities. Good night, everyone, and thank you again, ladies. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pitts.
Thank you, Dr. Pitts. Good night, everyone.
Good night.